It all began with a moment that seemed almost casual, almost insignificant, yet it revealed something so explosive that even years later, people still debate whether it was a glimpse into the real agenda of the United States after the September 11 attacks. Imagine this: a decorated four-star General Wesley Clark, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, steps into the Pentagon shortly after the dust of 9/11 had barely settled. He is not there for a grand mission briefing or a carefully staged media statement. He is there, he says, to talk with old colleagues, to feel the pulse of the military establishment during one of the most defining moments in modern history. And then, unexpectedly, he is handed a memo, a simple piece of paper. But what it contained would later shake the world when he decided to reveal it publicly. Clark described this experience years later, in a 2007 interview, and in speeches that spread quickly across alternative media platforms and political discussions. According to him, this was no ordinary document. It was a top-level outline of a master plan, a blueprint of the United States military strategy that went far beyond chasing al-Qaeda in the caves of Afghanistan. Clark said that a fellow officer told him bluntly that the United States was preparing to take out 7 countries in 5 years. That phrase alone carries the weight of an empire's ambition, the cold and clinical tone of an agenda that reaches beyond justice for 9/11 victims. The 7 countries listed in that memo were Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. Each of these nations, at that moment in history, had its own unique political structure, alliances, and challenges. Yet in the eyes of this plan, they were all placed in the same category: governments marked for destruction, destabilization, or regime change. Clark said the plan was not about responding to terrorism in the conventional sense, but about reshaping the entire Middle East and surrounding regions to fit a vision of American dominance. When General Clark first heard this, he was stunned. Why these specific countries? Why such a precise and aggressive timeline? It was not 5 decades or even 5 presidential terms. It was just 5 years. It seemed less like a security measure and more like a sweeping project, something coordinated at the highest levels, with goals that were not openly discussed in public. The revelation suggests that before the world had even begun to fully absorb the meaning of the Twin Towers collapsing, there were already conversations about which governments would fall next. For the general public, the narrative presented after 9/11 was about protecting America, preventing another attack, and rooting out terrorist networks. But Clark's account suggested something entirely different was happening in the halls of power. If true, it meant that the war in Afghanistan was only the opening chapter. The actual book was much longer and much more dangerous. The Pentagon was looking beyond Osama bin Laden, beyond al-Qaeda, and beyond Afghanistan. It was looking at entire sovereign nations that had not attacked the United States, but were nevertheless included on a hit list. This revelation matters because it explains why the United States, after invading Afghanistan, did not stop. The next step was Iraq, justified publicly with claims about weapons of mass destruction that were never found. But if we put Iraq into the context of the 7 countries in 5 years plan, it suddenly makes sense why that invasion seemed rushed, why the intelligence was flimsy, and why the administration appeared so determined to topple Saddam Hussein, regardless of global opposition. According to Clark's story, Iraq was simply next on the list. As Clark himself put it, the document revealed a policy coup in Washington. The normal process of public debate, congressional scrutiny, or international diplomacy was not driving these decisions. Instead, it was a small circle of policymakers and strategists shaping a vision for the Middle East behind closed doors. Clark hinted that the neoconservative ideology, which was dominant in the Bush administration, played a central role. For them, American power was meant to be projected globally, with military force as the primary tool. The countries chosen in that memo were not random. Each of them represented either a challenge to American influence or a potential threat to allies, such as Israel. Iraq had oil and a defiant regime. Syria and Lebanon were tied to Hezbollah and Iran. Libya under Gaddafi had resisted Western control. Somalia and Sudan were unstable but strategically important in Africa, and Iran was the ultimate prize. The nation seen as the most serious challenger to American hegemony in the Middle East. Clark's revelation did not just expose a possible plan. It raised questions about morality, legality, and the true cost of such an agenda. If the United States was actively planning to dismantle governments and destabilize entire regions, what did that say about the real meaning of the war on terror? Was it ever about justice for September 11? Or was 9/11 the trigger that provided the excuse for a much broader operation that had been waiting for the right moment to begin? What makes Clark's account so haunting is not only the words of the memo, but the accuracy with which the events that followed seemed to align with it. Iraq was invaded in 2003. Libya fell to chaos after NATO's intervention in 2011. Syria descended into civil war, fueled in part by foreign interference. Somalia and Sudan remained mired in conflict. Iran faced continuous pressure, sanctions, and covert operations. The timeline of 5 years did not play out exactly as written, but the pattern of targeting and destabilization undeniably echoed the contents of the memo. This was not just a fleeting anecdote told by a retired general. It became a lens through which many people began to re-examine every U.S. military action after 9/11. Suddenly, wars that had seemed disconnected could be seen as pieces of a larger puzzle. And the puzzle, when completed, painted a picture of a deliberate strategy to remake the Middle East according to American interests, regardless of the cost to the people who actually lived in those countries. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11 attacks, the United States government presented the world with a clear and emotionally powerful narrative. America had been attacked by terrorists, and America would respond with decisive force. The official message was simple, direct, and resonant. This was a war on terror, a war to protect freedom, and a war to ensure that nothing like September 11 would ever happen again. The Bush administration emphasized themes of justice, security, and democracy. Every speech, every press conference, every address to the nation reinforced this perspective. The focus was on al-Qaeda, on Osama bin Laden, and on eliminating terrorist safe havens, wherever they might exist. For the American people, still traumatized and grieving, the narrative provided a sense of purpose and unity. It was not just a military campaign, it was a moral mission. But beneath this carefully crafted message, many observers and critics began to notice a growing disconnect between the official narrative and the actual actions taken by the United States. While the government spoke of hunting terrorists, the wars that followed increasingly targeted sovereign states with complex political and economic landscapes. Afghanistan was the first, and in the context of the September 11 attacks, it made sense to the public. The Taliban had provided sanctuary to al-Qaeda. The logic was consistent with the official narrative. Yet when the United States turned its attention toward Iraq, the official story began to fray. The Bush administration insisted that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and that he posed an imminent threat to the United States and its allies. This claim was repeated endlessly, becoming the central justification for war. However, as the world later learned, those weapons did not exist. Intelligence had been exaggerated, manipulated, or outright fabricated. The question then arose: if Iraq had nothing to do with September 11 and possessed no weapons of mass destruction, why was it invaded with such urgency? The official narrative could not fully explain it, but the hidden agenda revealed by Wesley Clark's account suddenly cast it in a new light. Iraq, as one of the 7 countries on the Pentagon's list, was not targeted because of weapons or terror. It was targeted because it fit into a larger, predetermined strategy. This is where the distinction between the official narrative and the hidden agenda becomes stark. The official narrative was for public consumption, designed to rally support both at home and abroad. It spoke the language of fear, morality, and justice. The hidden agenda, however, was rooted in geopolitics, resource control, and the long-term projection of American power. To put it bluntly, the official narrative explained what America wanted people to believe, while the hidden agenda explained why America was actually acting the way it did. Consider the language used in the early 2000s by senior officials in Washington. Words like freedom, liberty, and democracy were invoked constantly. The promise was that the Middle East would be transformed, that despotic regimes would fall, and that liberated people would embrace Western-style democracy. It was presented as an altruistic mission, almost a gift from America to the world. Yet the reality on the ground told a different story. The interventions often left nations not with democracy, but with devastation. Instead of stable, free societies, what emerged were fractured states, endless wars, and humanitarian crises. This contradiction between words and outcomes forces one to ask whether spreading democracy was ever the true objective. The hidden agenda points toward other explanations. Oil and natural resources were an undeniable factor. Iraq, Libya, and Iran all hold massive energy reserves. Control over these resources meant not only economic leverage, but also strategic dominance over global markets. The Middle East has always been a region where energy, power, and politics intersect. Securing influence there has been a cornerstone of American foreign policy for decades. After 9/11, the opportunity to pursue that influence under the cover of fighting terror became far more viable. Another element of the hidden agenda involves geopolitics beyond resources. The countries on the Pentagon list shared another common feature. Many of them were aligned against American allies, especially Israel, or they maintained ties with U.S. rivals such as Russia and, to some extent, China. By destabilizing or dismantling these regimes, the United States could weaken opposition to its allies, reduce the influence of rival powers, and cement its dominance in the region. Syria and Iran, for example, have been consistent supporters of Hezbollah and critics of Israel. Libya under Gaddafi sought independence from Western financial structures. Sudan and Somalia represented footholds of instability, where foreign influence could reshape the balance of power. All of these considerations point toward strategic calculations that go far beyond the stated objective of stopping terrorism. The military-industrial complex also looms large in this distinction between narrative and agenda. Wars generate enormous profits for defense contractors, weapons manufacturers, and private military companies. The longer the conflicts last, the more lucrative they become. The official narrative framed the wars as necessary sacrifices to protect American lives. The hidden agenda, however, ensured that the machinery of war kept turning, providing financial incentives for those who benefited from perpetual conflict. The connection between policy decisions and profit margins cannot be ignored in this context. The moral weight of this discrepancy is staggering. If the official narrative was about justice and security, then the hidden agenda reveals a cold calculus in which entire nations were destabilized not for the safety of Americans, but for strategic and economic gain. It also explains why the official justifications often appeared thin or inconsistent. They were not meant to withstand deep scrutiny. They were meant to rally immediate support, to create urgency, and to shut down dissent. Anyone who questioned the official story was painted as unpatriotic or accused of supporting terrorism. This was the shield that protected the hidden agenda from exposure, at least in the short term. Over time, however, as more information came to light, and as the consequences of these wars became impossible to ignore, the gap between narrative and reality widened. The promise of democracy gave way to the reality of failed states. The claim of protecting American security gave way to the reality of endless wars that seemed to create more enemies than they destroyed. And the justification of eliminating weapons of mass destruction gave way to the truth that there were none to begin with. This pattern repeated itself across multiple countries, each time revealing the same underlying strategy. When examining the trajectory of United States foreign policy after September 11, one cannot ignore the recurring theme of destabilization. The concept of destabilization is not simply about toppling governments or launching direct invasions. It is a much broader, multifaceted approach that involves dismantling the political, economic, and social foundations of a nation so that it can no longer function as an independent or powerful state. The aftermath of September 11 provided the justification, the cover, and the momentum for a strategy that had likely been considered long before the towers fell in New York City. Once the war on terror became the dominant narrative, destabilization became the hidden mechanism by which the United States and its allies sought to reshape the Middle East and surrounding regions in ways that aligned with their long-term interests. At the core of destabilization lies the idea that a weakened and fragmented region is easier to control than a strong and unified one. Independent governments that resist Western influence maintain control over their own resources or align themselves with rival powers pose obstacles to American hegemony. The solution, then, is not always to build stable democracies, as the official narrative promised, but rather to ensure that these governments are either replaced with compliant regimes or left so fractured that they can never pose a significant threat again. This is why so many of the nations on the Pentagon's list revealed by Wesley Clark experienced not liberation, but chaos. Iraq, Libya, Syria, Somalia, and Sudan all became case studies in how destabilization operates as both a tactic and a long-term strategy. Consider Iraq. Before the 2003 invasion, it was ruled by Saddam Hussein, an authoritarian leader, but one who maintained internal order and posed no immediate threat to the United States homeland. The official justification for invasion rested on claims about weapons of mass destruction. But once the invasion took place, the reality became clear. There were no such weapons. What followed instead was the dismantling of Iraq's state apparatus. The military was disbanded, the government structure was dissolved, and the country was thrown into a power vacuum. Instead of building a strong democracy as promised, The United States left Iraq with sectarian violence, insurgency, and eventually the rise of groups like ISIS. This was destabilization in its most brutal form. The destruction of Iraq's capacity to govern itself ensured that it would never return to its former position of regional power. Libya followed a similar trajectory. Muammar Gaddafi, though vilified in the West, had created a state with functioning institutions and a degree of stability. When NATO intervened in 2011 under the banner of humanitarian protection, the intervention quickly turned into a campaign for regime change. Gaddafi was killed, but what replaced him was not democracy. It was anarchy. Multiple factions vied for control, militias carved out territories, and Libya became a hub for human trafficking and terrorism. Once again, the result was not stability, but the dismantling of a state that could have resisted Western pressure. Libya's oil wealth, instead of being used for national development, became another prize in a fractured landscape. Syria became another front in this pattern of destabilization. When protests began in 2011, they were quickly seized upon by external actors who armed opposition groups and turned the unrest into a full-scale civil war. While the official line was about supporting democracy and stopping a brutal dictator, the effect was the near-complete destruction of one of the most historically significant states in the Middle East. Cities were reduced to rubble, millions of people were displaced, and extremist groups flourished in the chaos. Whether or not regime change was achieved, the objective of destabilization was clear. Syria would never again serve as a stronghold of resistance against Western or Israeli interests. Sudan and Somalia represent another dimension of the strategy. These nations were already unstable, but instead of fostering genuine peace or development, Western interventions often deepened divisions. Somalia became synonymous with lawlessness, piracy, and militant groups, while Sudan endured decades of civil war, partition, and continuing strife. Their instability provided convenient justification for ongoing foreign involvement and influence, ensuring that they could never emerge as independent powers that could challenge the regional order. The effectiveness of destabilization as a strategy lies not only in direct military action, but also in the use of sanctions, covert operations, and proxy wars. Sanctions cripple economies, pushing societies toward desperation and collapse. Covert operations manipulate political movements and fuel unrest. Proxy wars allow the United States and its allies to weaken states indirectly, while maintaining plausible deniability. All of these tools contribute to the long-term goal of ensuring that potential rivals remain distracted by internal conflict, rather than projecting influence externally. Another layer of destabilization is psychological and cultural. By presenting interventions as humanitarian missions or struggles for democracy, the United States framed its actions as noble. Yet for the populations of these countries, the reality was disillusionment, suffering, and loss of trust in the very ideals that were supposedly being defended. This erosion of faith in governance and international norms adds to the destabilization, making it even harder for these societies to rebuild or to trust future political structures. The consequences of this strategy ripple far beyond the immediate targets. Neighboring countries absorb waves of refugees, placing enormous strain on their own economies and stability. Extremist groups, born from power vacuums, spread violence across borders. Entire regions become associated with conflict, deterring investment and development for decades. In this sense, destabilization is not only a tactic, but also a long-term condition that reshapes entire regions, leaving them dependent, fractured, and vulnerable to continued manipulation. The pattern is undeniable when viewed collectively. Each intervention or pressure campaign is justified in isolation, framed by the official narrative of fighting terror or promoting democracy. Yet when examined together, they form a mosaic of destabilization that cannot be explained by coincidence alone. The 7 countries listed in the Pentagon Memo were not random choices. They were deliberately selected targets, where destabilization would serve broader geopolitical purposes by ensuring that these nations could not function as unified, independent powers. The United States and its allies preserved their dominance over a strategically vital region. When looking closely at the trajectory of American foreign policy, after September 11, 2001, it becomes evident that the wars, interventions, and covert operations were not driven solely by fear of terrorism or the desire to spread democracy. Beneath the official justifications lay deep geopolitical and economic interests that shaped the real agenda. Every action in the Middle East and surrounding regions, from the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan to the destabilization of Libya and Syria, can be linked to strategic imperatives that extend far beyond the narratives sold to the public. The phrase, 7 countries in 5 years, revealed by General Wesley Clark, was not just about military campaigns, but about securing influence, resources, and dominance in areas that had long been at the heart of global power struggles. The Middle East and North Africa represent the world's richest concentration of oil and natural gas reserves. For over a century, energy has been the lifeblood of industrial economies and military power. Whoever controls these resources and the routes through which they are transported wields enormous influence on a global scale. American policymakers understood this reality well. After September 11, the atmosphere of fear and urgency created a unique opportunity to advance an agenda that had been quietly developing even before the attacks. By presenting interventions as defensive measures in a war against terror, the United States could pursue the very tangible objective of securing energy dominance without openly stating it. Iraq was the most obvious case. With some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world, Iraq had long been a prize for global powers. Saddam Hussein's regime, however, was resistant to Western control. His attempts to trade oil outside of the U.S. dollar system threatened the petrodollar order that underpins American economic power. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was framed around weapons of mass destruction and ties to terrorism, but neither claim held up under scrutiny. What did hold up was Iraq's strategic importance in terms of energy and its position in the heart of the Middle East. The war removed a defiant regime and replaced it with one that could be more easily influenced, while at the same time fragmenting the country so thoroughly that it could never again emerge as a strong, independent regional power. Libya provides another revealing example. Muammar Gaddafi controlled significant oil resources and sought to chart an independent economic path for Africa. He proposed creating a gold-backed African currency that could challenge the dominance of the US dollar and the euro in global trade. Such a move would have disrupted Western financial influence not only in North Africa, but across the entire continent. In 2011, NATO intervened under the pretext of preventing a humanitarian disaster. In reality, the intervention destroyed Gaddafi's government, killed him, and left the country in chaos. The oil fields that had once been under national control became contested and, in many cases, opened up to Western interests. The dream of a united African economic independence was buried in the rubble of Libya's civil war. Syria, though not as resource-rich as Iraq or Libya, held enormous geopolitical value. Its alliance with Iran and its support for Hezbollah in Lebanon placed it in direct opposition to American and Israeli interests. Syria also occupies a strategic location that could serve as a transit hub for pipelines, connecting Middle Eastern energy to European markets. By destabilizing Syria and seeking to remove Bashar al-Assad, the United States and its allies could weaken Iran's regional influence, protect Israeli security interests, and potentially control future energy routes. The war in Syria, justified publicly as support for democracy and human rights, has left the nation shattered, with millions displaced and its infrastructure in ruins. The hidden agenda of reshaping regional power balances is visible in every stage of that conflict. Iran stands as the ultimate example of how geopolitical and economic interests intertwine. As one of the 7 countries on the Pentagon's list, Iran has always been a central concern for American strategists. With vast oil and gas reserves, a strategic position bordering the Persian Gulf, and a political system fiercely independent of Western influence, Iran represents both an economic competitor and a geopolitical obstacle. The push for sanctions, isolation, and potential regime change has never been solely about Iran's nuclear program. As the official narrative claims, it has been about ensuring that Iran does not become a dominant regional power or capable of challenging American influence or threatening the security of Israel. Containing Iran and, if possible, weakening it from within has remained a consistent goal of American foreign policy. Beyond individual nations, the broader strategy reflects the timeless logic of geopolitics. The Middle East has always been the crossroads of continents, empires, and trade routes. Whoever dominates this region holds a central advantage in global affairs. After the Cold War, the United States emerged as the sole superpower, and controlling the Middle East became a way to cement that status. Russia's influence in the region was already weakened. But any resurgence of Russian or Chinese power there would directly challenge American primacy by destabilizing states that had ties to Moscow or Beijing. Washington ensured that its rivals could not use these nations as footholds for expanding their influence. In this way, the hidden agenda after 9/11 was as much about containing future threats as it was about exploiting current opportunities. The economic dimension extended into the structure of global finance. The petrodollar system, in which oil is traded primarily in US dollars, has been a pillar of American economic dominance since the mid-20th century. Any nation that attempted to bypass this system, whether Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Libya under Gaddafi, or potentially Iran, became a target. Protecting the dollar's role in global trade was not discussed openly in speeches or press briefings, but it underpinned the logic of intervention. By ensuring that energy markets remained tied to the dollar, the United States secured a steady demand for its currency, giving it unparalleled leverage in global finance. Israel's security was another critical piece of the puzzle. The countries listed in the Pentagon Memo, particularly Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Iran, were among the strongest opponents of Israel's regional dominance. By weakening or destabilizing them, the United States simultaneously advanced Israeli strategic interests. This alignment of American and Israeli goals created a powerful incentive to pursue policies that would reshape the map of the Middle East in ways favorable to both nations. Taken together, these geopolitical and economic interests explain why the official narratives often sounded hollow or contradictory. The claim of spreading democracy did not match the chaos that followed. The claim of fighting terrorism did not explain why entire nations unrelated to September 11 were targeted. The true agenda lay in controlling resources, maintaining financial dominance, protecting allies, and suppressing potential rivals. Each war and each intervention can be traced back to these interests, which reveal themselves far more clearly than the words spoken at press conferences or the justifications offered to the public. The long-term consequences of the United States strategy after September 11 reveal a reality that stretches far beyond the official narrative of a war on terror. What was presented and spread democratization to eliminate extremist threats and spread it up, reshaping entire regions in ways that continue to reverberate across the world. The 7 countries identified in the Pentagon Memo revealed by General Wesley Clark: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran, were all affected in varying degrees by this agenda, and the results were neither peace nor democracy. Instead, the consequences have been instability, endless wars, humanitarian disasters, and the empowerment of forces that the United States itself once claimed to be fighting. These outcomes were not short-term accidents. They became entrenched conditions that have lasted decades, reshaping global politics, economies, and societies. Iraq serves as the most glaring example. The invasion of 2003 destroyed Saddam Hussein's government, but also dismantled the very structures that allowed Iraq to function as a stable state. The disbanding of the Iraqi military and the de-Baathification policy left hundreds of thousands of armed and trained individuals without jobs or allegiance to the new order. This decision created the perfect environment for insurgencies and extremist groups to rise. By 2014, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, better known as ISIS, controlled vast territories across Iraq and Syria, unleashing brutality that shocked the world. The supposed mission to eliminate terrorism had instead created conditions that allowed one of the most violent terrorist organizations in modern history to thrive. The war left hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dead, millions displaced, and the country fragmented along sectarian lines. 2 decades later, Iraq still struggles with corruption, weak governance, and foreign interference, showing how destabilization became a permanent condition rather than a temporary stage. Libya's story demonstrates a similar pattern. The NATO intervention of 2011, justified under the pretext of preventing mass atrocities, ended with the fall and gruesome death of Muammar Gaddafi. What followed was not stability but chaos. Libya descended into civil war, with rival governments and militias fighting for control. The nation, that once had one of the highest standards of living in Africa, collapsed into a failed state, where human trafficking, arms smuggling, and extremist groups flourished. Migrants attempting to cross the Mediterranean found themselves trapped in a country with no functioning central authority, subjected to violence, enslavement, and exploitation. The intervention, which was supposed to protect civilians, left Libya as a cautionary tale of how foreign involvement can dismantle a functioning state and replace it with endless disorder. Syria presents perhaps the most devastating humanitarian crisis of this era. What began as protests in 2011 escalated into a brutal civil war, fueled in part by foreign interference and proxy battles. The United States and its allies supported opposition groups, while Russia and Iran backed the Assad government. The result was a proxy war that destroyed entire cities, displaced over half of Syria's population, and created one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. Millions of Syrians fled to neighboring countries and Europe, straining resources and reshaping political debates in those regions. The United States claimed to support democracy in Syria, but the reality was a shattered nation where extremist groups exploited the chaos. The long-term consequence for Syria has been not liberation but devastation, with reconstruction seeming almost impossible amid ongoing divisions and foreign influence. Somalia and Sudan. Although less discussed in mainstream conversations, also illustrate the enduring effects of destabilization. Somalia has remained synonymous with lawlessness and violence since the early 1990s, and foreign involvement has often intensified the conflict rather than resolving it. The rise of the extremist group al-Shabaab turned Somalia into another front in the so-called war on terror, but decades of intervention have done little to build a functioning state. Instead, Somalia continues to rely heavily on international aid while struggling with internal conflict and fragmentation. Sudan, on the other hand, faced civil wars, partition, and constant pressure from external actors. The long-term consequence for both countries has been prolonged instability that prevents them from emerging as independent, self-sufficient nations. Another long-term consequence of these policies has been the massive displacement of populations. From Iraq to Syria to Libya, millions of people have been uprooted from their homes. Refugee camps in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and beyond became semi-permanent settlements where generations grew up without stability. The refugee crisis not only created humanitarian tragedies, but also reshaped global politics. In Europe, the influx of refugees fueled political debates, strengthened nationalist movements, and challenged the cohesion of the European Union. The destabilization of the Middle East spilled directly into the heart of Western societies, altering elections, policies, and public opinion for years to come. The rise of extremist groups is another undeniable consequence. Whether it was ISIS in Iraq and Syria, al-Shabaab in Somalia, or various militias in Libya, the vacuum left by collapsed governments created fertile ground for extremism. These groups not only terrorized local populations, but also carried out attacks abroad, spreading insecurity far beyond the borders of the Middle East and Africa. Ironically, the very forces that the United States had claimed to fight became stronger as a result of its interventions. This paradox undermined the credibility of the official narrative and highlighted the destructive nature of the hidden agenda. The economic consequences have also been profound. Wars and instability destroyed infrastructure, crippled economies, and reduced entire nations to dependency on foreign aid. Iraq's oil wealth was plundered, Libya's economy collapsed, and Syria's once thriving cities were reduced to rubble. Meanwhile, defense contractors and corporations connected to reconstruction profited immensely, showing how the military-industrial complex benefited from continuous conflict. For ordinary people in these regions, however, the consequence was poverty, unemployment, and a future marked by uncertainty. On a geopolitical level, the long-term consequences include a realignment of global power. Russia reasserted itself through its intervention in Syria, using the conflict to project power and challenge American dominance. China expanded its influence through economic partnerships in Africa and the Middle East, filling the void left by weakened states. The United States, instead of solidifying control, found itself entangled in endless wars that drained resources, damaged credibility, and sparked global criticism. The promise of a quick reshaping of the Middle East turned into a prolonged entanglement with no clear victories, leaving the United States exposed to accusations of imperialism and hypocrisy. Perhaps the most profound consequence lies in the perception of the United States itself. The rhetoric of spreading democracy lost its meaning when the results were failed states, broken societies, and endless suffering. Trust in international institutions eroded as interventions were seen as masks for hidden agendas. The moral authority that the United States once claimed in global affairs was severely damaged, replaced by suspicion and resentment. For the people of Iraq, Libya, Syria, Somalia, and Sudan, the word freedom became associated not with hope but with foreign bombs, destroyed homes, and shattered lives. The long-term consequences, therefore, extend across political, social, economic, and psychological dimensions. The destabilization of entire nations created ripple effects that reshaped global migration, empowered extremist groups, drained economies, shifted alliances, and redefined the image of the United States on the world stage. These consequences reveal that the real cost of the post-9/11 agenda was not limited to the battlefields where soldiers fought, but extended into the lives of millions of civilians whose futures were rewritten by wars they never chose. The story of America's plan after 9/11, as revealed by General Wesley Clark and supported by the subsequent events that unfolded in the Middle East, represents one of the most significant examples of long-term geopolitical engineering in modern history. What began as the War on Terror quickly evolved into a series of carefully targeted interventions aimed not only at individual leaders or governments, but at the very stability of entire nations. Iraq, Syria, Libya, Sudan, Somalia, and others were drawn into wars that left behind fractured states, broken institutions, and populations suffering under the weight of displacement, violence, and poverty. While the public narrative sold to citizens in the United States and to much of the world was framed around national security, weapons of mass destruction, and the promotion of democracy, the outcomes tell another story. The Middle East, once defined by strong states capable of resisting external influence, was left in a state of constant turmoil. The weakening of governments, the rise of militant groups, and the spread of sectarian conflict illustrate that the true impact of these policies was destabilization rather than stabilization. At the heart of this strategy lay deeper motivations: securing access to energy resources, ensuring the protection of strategic allies such as Israel, limiting the regional influence of Iran, and containing the reach of powers like Russia and China. These interests, coupled with the vast profits generated for the military-industrial complex, created a cycle where endless conflict served as both a means and an end. The plan to take down 7 countries in 5 years was never fully completed in the exact time frame envisioned, but the spirit of that strategy defined 2 decades of United States foreign policy. The consequences are still felt today. Millions of lives have been lost or displaced. Entire nations remain politically fragmented, and extremist groups born out of these power vacuums continue to destabilize the region and spread violence beyond its borders. The promise of democracy and freedom was replaced by failed states, corruption, and authoritarian resurgence. For the people of the Middle East, the past 20 years have been a story of resilience in the face of imposed chaos. For the world, it has been a sobering reminder that behind every official justification, there often exists another purpose, one that is rarely spoken but deeply consequential.